So have you ever tried to share?
Good morning. Hopefully you can hear me. Oh, another late one. Right, so while I wait for a few more people to join, here's the usual preamble. This isn't my normal channel. This is a new streaming channel. So you got to sub to this one as well if you want to get alerts and so on. So be a lovely person and do that and subscribe to this channel as well. What else has been happening? You'll see information for backing subscription services like Patreon and Subscribestar slowly scrolling past at the bottom. So if you feel so inclined, that would be lovely. If you want to just drop a tip in the jar, then my PayPal me is there as well. There's a lot of news stories today. I'm still struggling a bit with the YouTube streaming and getting it to work with OBS and getting my camera to be recognized every time for some reason. But yeah, there you go. Getting the hang of it slowly. The quirks. Just in time for them to change it again, I'm quite sure. Hey, why are you set to top chat when you should be set to live chat? Speaking of problems, top chat, live chat. Pop out the window, get the address. Still says top chat. Caution, irritating. Oh, it resets when you... Never mind. I'll keep an eye on it there. What else is going on? Not a lot. Next month is October, which will be Schlocktoberfest, which is something I do occasionally during October, which is to just churn out a bunch of very cheap ideas stuff. I'm not sure when 200 word RPG month is, but I might do stuff for that as well. You know, monsters, horror themed stuff, schlocky themed stuff. That's the name of the game, really. Gotta pay off that fucking cam belt somehow. Right, I'm sure people will turn up as we go on. So, I'll deal with any questions or anything towards the end. Alright, let's get through it. Stuff to do. So, the Tory party conference has started, despite there being talk about them cancelling it because of all the Brexit kerfuffle and that Parliament wasn't prorogued after all, according to the High Court. So they're announcing all kinds of stuff that they supposedly intend to do. And it's the end of austerity, apparently, which is welcome, but they're not being entirely honest in a lot of the stuff. So they're talking about loads and loads of new hospitals. But that isn't actually the case. The funding they've released isn't for the building of new hospitals, though they fast-tracked 6 of them. I think they're talking about something like 30 new hospitals. But the money for those isn't money to actually build hospitals. It's the go-ahead and a little bit of money to look into the feasibility of expanding or rebuilding or building new hospitals in certain NHS trust areas. So they're presenting it as we're embarking on this ambitious program of building hospitals because we're good at public services. Forget our entire history up until this point. Not the case. Yesterday, I think they confirmed £25 billion for road upgrades. And frankly, I has a bit of a suspicious about that as well. That's conjoined for some reason with supposedly £5 billion to fund ultra-fast broadband in some of the UK's hardest to reach areas. Now, ultra-fast by British standards would be 20 to 50 megabits fibre. That's welcome if it's true. The old Tory Transport Secretary used to live near where I am, and for all he was a Tory, he was pretty good on technical innovation and trying to get this done here, and yet we didn't get fast broadband until he was out of office and had retired. So these wheels move pretty slowly. Now, I'm somewhat concerned that this is also not particularly truthful. The funding had already been set aside by May, so Johnson and Javid appear to be trying to take credit for that, and I didn't trust May either, but I trust them even less. Especially if we're in for a no-deal Brexit crash and probable recession. At that point, they might try and spend their way out of it, which will work better than austerity, but eventually you do run out of money. And a prosperous society is better able to afford these things. So there's a whole bunch of other plans for electric buses and better bus services and so on. If that's true, that would be lovely. They're saying this digital infrastructure, this $5 billion, will go towards gigabit capable internet. Again, I roll to disbelieve. And 5G, which has become controversial because it's Chinese companies that were being given the contracts. And there were concerns about spyware and so on, which were apparently fairly founded. So who knows what's actually going on? I don't trust any of them anymore. And while all this is going on and they're talking about these amazing plans that they have, the opposition, which may I remind you is now in the majority, are talking about how to stop a no-deal Brexit, though we've already got laws and so on in place. Bojo and Cummings seem to think they can get around that somehow. And that may mean a vote of no confidence and a government of national unity from amongst the opposition parties and the Conservative defectors. Trouble with that is that Labour, who are the biggest bloc, want to put Corbyn in as a temporary PM, and a lot of other people, including the Liberal Democrats and the ex-Tories, whether they've moved into a party or not, are not keen on that idea. Plus, he's not really against Brexit. My solution would be to put Tom Watson, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, in as the interim Prime Minister, because he has a lot of respect and is not as controversial a figure and isn't on the Marxist-Leninists side of the Labour Party. But the Corbynistas seem to find that idea laughable. He's a disloyal man to great leader. And Swinson, in her eagerness to embrace the former Tories, is moving the Liberal Democrats to the right. It's all fooked, to put it mildly. Oi gewalt. What a world, what a world. What a world we all live in at the moment. I just do not know what to make of it all, quite frankly, other than a mess. Right, what else have we got? Inequalities in heart attack care are costing women's lives. So we're given to understand. Now this is actually a really old story that turns up time and time and time again. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, men do suffer from heart attacks and heart disease in general more than women, but the symptoms are different for heart attacks between men and women. You know, the typical film version, oh, I can't feel my arm, that kind of thing. That's more of a male presentation of a heart attack. So, because everyone thinks of that as being the sign of a heart attack, they don't recognise the signs of a heart attack in women, and so women's heart attacks go unnoticed, relatively speaking. And they reckon that over 10 years, so, 8,000 women in England and Wales, just England and Wales, Scotland's separate for reasons, because it's Scotland. That about 8,000 women over 10 years died unnecessarily after a heart attack, though over that time this has been improving somewhat. And they attribute this to these myths, like heart attacks only affecting men, which they don't, but it is more common in men, as I understand. Okay, they're refuting what I was just telling you, though. So there's a misperception that men and women experienced completely different heart attack symptoms. Well, not so long ago, the government advice and the science was saying that they did. But what it actually appears to be is that symptoms differ from person to person, and chest pain is the most common symptom in both men and women. Okay, I was wrong, fair enough. But that's what they were telling us before. But yeah. Now, this is weird. It's a reversal of what we normally find. So women often delay seeking help. That's something that men normally do. More likely to receive an incorrect diagnosis for various reasons of unconscious bias and so on. Sorry, my pocket's going off. And there's a lot to do today, so I need to keep on top of that. And risk factors such as smoking, high blood pressure, poor diet and so on actually increase heart attack risks more in women than men. All fascinating stuff. Especially, I'm sure some people will use that as fodder for biological gender arguments. It's fair enough, I suppose. And this is a global problem, not just a UK problem. So, yeah, it's still men who are the majority, but women, it doesn't get dealt with. So something to keep in mind, though I did turn out to be wrong about the symptoms. I blame the government. Historically, we think of gay conversion therapy as being a kind of American thing. You know, it's associated with Mike Pence, and he's shown in memes and so on as having lightning powers and so on, which is a bit silly, but there you go. But we think of that as being an American thing, this kind of browbeating gay conversion therapy. But apparently this was going on in the UK in the 1970s at Queen's University Belfast. Now, of course, Ireland, particularly Northern Ireland, is a bit backward when it comes to these kind of things. Well, Northern Ireland's backward on some of these things, and Southern Ireland is backward on some other things, like abortion's only just been legalised and they're still working it through in Southern Ireland. But yeah, the churches in Northern Ireland are pretty bad. I fenced with a guy who was part of a group called Christian Identity back in the day. Now, that was an American organisation of religious extremists who adhere to what they call Noahide law. So very Old Testament Christians, and they were setting their sights on Northern Ireland as a place to gather recruits and to radicalize people. This was about 5-6 years ago. I ended up getting a hacker mate to get information on them and feeding it to the constabulary because they were talking about actual terrorism and things, and that's where I draw the line at free speech, I think. But yeah, there's just Northern Ireland's a bit of a dodgy place when it comes to religious issues. But this was during the 70s, and yeah, people were given electroshock as aversion therapy to pictures of naked men and so on. At the time, there was a lot of pressure on homosexuals in the late 60s through the 70s. Acceptance didn't really happen until the late 70s through to the 1980s, and a lot of people wanted to cure themselves, not because of anything else particularly, but just because of the sheer social pressure and horrors. Right? And so aversion therapy was experimented with in various ways. There were some chemical experiments. I think this was earlier. I think that was the 1950s, where homosexual men would be admitted to hospital, exposed to arousing images of men, but given equivalents of like Ipecac and whatever. So they would come to associate, stomach pain, shitting themselves, throwing up, and so on with arousal over male images. So we don't exactly have a spotless history there, just not as bad and not quite as through into modernity as America has had. But at least this stuff is coming to light, and maybe some justice will be brought. I don't know. I mean, it wasn't illegal then, and you can't really hold people accountable for laws that didn't exist, but it's good to know that this was going on, and it might help cement opposition to it moving forward. One can hope. Let me just get rid of my Facebook, which is blinging and making annoying messages. Right, moving back to Labour policy, we talked about how their plan is to abolish private schools to an extent, and to kind of repatriate them to the public. I'm not sure about this policy, though in principle I agree that public education would be a lot better off if all that money and the poached decent teachers and so on was ploughed into public education, especially in the inner cities and so on, where it's really needed. And it's a shame that people can buy such a level of advantage. But I don't know that this is a vote-winning strategy. I think that will piss off a lot of wealthy donors and people who might otherwise back a more centrist version of the Labour Party. It will piss off a lot of influential people who can help bend elections. So I'm not entirely or even slightly convinced that this is a great policy, and it's kind of extreme, and it plays into a lot of hysteria about the Labour Party, that they're all communists and want to seize the means of production and all the rest of it. I agree with nationalisation in other areas. This, I don't know. I would rather see like a quota introduced for places like Eton and Harrow and all these other posh boy schools, that they have to take in a certain number of commoners. And I don't necessarily have anything against streaming people by their talent and accomplishment level, right? And it's a lot less stressful and a lot easier for students when they're amongst people of a similar sort of educational attainment level, native talent, whatever you want to call it. I did really well at school, but I went to a publicly owned school, comprehensive. But I did not get on with languages, French and German, right? I mean, I could do it, but it was an enormous stressor on my life. I was dreading every day I had a language lesson and so on. So eventually, I successfully argued I should put me down one of the sort of grade levels so that it was easier for me to cope with. And that made a huge difference, and also got me away from a couple of nasty teachers. Yeah, for some reason, languages had particularly nasty teachers who I didn't get on with. But that was better for me, and that, I was high attainment pretty much across the board. Not to toot my own horn, but for me that was difficult. I wanted to, it was affecting my other studies because I was getting so stressed. Probably an early warning sign of the depression, come to think of it. It got to the point where I was bunking off school to avoid language lessons at one point, even though I still did well. But but I'm not sure about this policy. I don't think it's a vote winner. I would much rather see a certain amount of quotas brought in. I mean, in principle, I agree, right? We should concentrate on public education and allowing people to have this massive step up, whether they have talent or not, simply because their parents can afford to buy it for them. Not so sure about that, but I think strategically this is a bad move, and it plays into the hands of their opponents, who are trying to spread this kind of commie panic about them. Renationalising the railways, bus services, ending right to buy for council houses, power, water, those things I can agree with. I don't think I would renationalise British Telecom anymore, because just the technology's moved on too far. But schools, to me, someone on the extreme left libertarian side, that seems a little too far. I think quotas is the best way to go about it. It does seem like the policy that they're suggesting is a kind of graduated abolition, and I think strategically, at least, that's a mistake, and that's coming from me. So yeah. There has been a spike in deaths caused by mixing cocaine and alcohol. So both of them can increase your chances of engaging in violent and impulsive behaviour, and they seem to act as a kind of force multiplier for each other when it comes to that. And during the last recording period, 13 self-inflicted deaths happened. They call it self-inflicted. It's not. It may be suicidal ideation down to this. It may be something else. People self-medicate, so it's a bit hard to disentangle. But yeah, the combination of the two doesn't seem particularly pleasant. Mind you, if you take cocaine, you're probably an asshole anyway. And it makes you more of an asshole. I have had to endure the company of coked up people, and they're not pleasant to be around. Drunks are a lot more pleasant to be around. So kids, don't mix it. People on ecstasy are also super annoying when you're not, and I steer clear of that one. I have weird side effects. You may have had wonderful times on MDMA, but just make sure it's pure, kids. Is cocaine cheap here? Relatively speaking, I'm given to understand that it is. Now, it used to be associated with like bankers and speculators, people like that. It used to be the rich boys' drug. But it's gotten a lot cheaper, or at least it had been getting a lot cheaper. Let me just find out for you. Okay, here the price has dropped around £41 per gram. So that is, let's see, £41 in Australian dollars. That's about $74. So yeah, it's a fuck sight cheaper. It used to be the rich guy's drug, right? And it hasn't been for a long time. and there was a story last year about a lot more cocaine being found on banknotes, which suggested, things were things were getting worse. And there was something about cocaine in the Thames water levels earlier this year. Record cocaine levels in the Thames, but probably not enough to make fish high, say experts. So it's become a much more common drug than it used to be, and it's lost a lot of its glamorous status over here. This has been going on for a long time. Sort of the tail end of my, relatively speaking, partying days, people were doing it a lot more, but it was still more expensive, and now it's super cheap. So yeah, about 75 Australian dollars a gram. So wow, that's Australian tourism going up, I think. But yeah, seriously, cocaine is a cunt's drug. Don't do it. Probably second only to heroin in how much of an arsehole it turns you into. Stick to safe ones. Pot's relatively safe. Mushrooms are relatively safe. That's about it. Everything else has some kind of potential long-term side effects. So there you go. What's the next story? Oh, speaking of inhaling things, firefighters with cancer have demanded that the government take action for them because, well, if you followed the aftermath of 9/11 first responders, you'll know that in the States, a hell of a lot of 9/11 first responders, the ones who didn't die in the collapses, a lot of them have had all kinds of cancer symptoms, as have a lot of survivors from the surrounding area due to the billowing dust and so on, and they've been fighting for support all that time and have only really recently been given it to a full extent. This doesn't just apply to them, though it's a highly visible example. Firefighters of all kinds, particularly, are often exposed to burning plastics and so on. Even with respirators and so on, they're still exposed to more of it than normal people. And this means that there is a spike of cancers amongst firefighters. Something to ask Noel Plum to do a video on. I would think he's a firefighter. So he'd know how serious this is. I think he's a member of the union, so he could probably get some decent information on that. So, something to ask him about. But yeah, the fire brigades unions called on the government to provide additional protection, screening, more money, better protective equipment, improved medical coverage, and so on. And I think that's only fair, to be honest. They haven't had a pay rise in quite a while, if I remember correctly. They went on sort of half-hearted strike, like most emergency services do, maybe a year back, or was it earlier this year? But if we can give them benefits in terms of healthcare and putting them to the head of the queue or whatever, if we could give them benefits like that, that might go some way to offsetting that issue as well. Part of it is also that firemen have this kind of rough and ready macho culture, so they just kind of ignore symptoms, don't clean their kit because that's seen as sort of showing that they work hard and so on. So yeah, if you know anyone who's a firefighter, it's probably something to bring up to them. And again, I'm no expert on this. Noel Plum would be the guy to go and ask in his comments section to do a video on this. If he hasn't already, he may have, and YouTube just simply hasn't presented it to me because you know how YouTube is. So Iran and Saudi Arabia look like they might kick off. I'll get to comments and questions at the end. The Saudi Arabian Crown Prince is warning that oil prices could rise to really high numbers, probably not seen since 1976, if the world does not act to deter Iran. This sounds to me like they want other people to do their work for them, but Saudi Arabia is a very rich nation. They're currently still aiding or spearheading the bombing of Yemen, which is an atrocity. But here they seem to want other countries to step in and do their work for them. I'm suspicious, right? Iran is a shitty country that does shitty things, but just because maybe terrorists who are Iranian did something and it's still not entirely clear exactly what happened or exactly who was responsible per se, I don't think we want to get dragged into another eternal war in the Middle East. You know, that Afghanistan is what killed the Soviet Union in no small part. It was just a grinder, a sink for money and troops, and helped foment dissatisfaction with the state of affairs there. I'm surprised we haven't seen more of that in the States, to be honest. But yeah, we just need to separate ourselves. This is another argument, incidentally, for renewable energy and alternative energy sources like nuclear, like pouring money into fusion and so on. We really need to break our addiction to Middle Eastern oil because it's such a disrupted area that it really affects supply. I mean, after all this happened, and quite some time later, there was a run on petrol here. I couldn't even get petrol one day because the queues were so long, people panic buying. That was combined with panic over Brexit, which the no-deal Brexit, if you look at Yellowhammer, that's not even really the worst case scenario. That's the base case scenario. They're talking about shortages. So you combine issues in Saudi Arabia with the tankers and the oil fields with Brexit, and yeah, it was tough getting petrol here a couple of weeks ago. Of course, this is Saudi Arabia, who are in the habit of killing journalists and doing all kinds of other horrible shit. This sounds like a threat to me. Basically, you guys toughen up and deal with Iran, or we're going to raise oil prices, is what it sounds like to me. So, yeah, we may see another war in the Middle East. The trouble is that it'll only shore up Iran's government. Nothing brings people together like a common enemy, and if the great Satan decides to attack Iran, people may set aside their concerns about their own government and turn on the Yanks. So yeah, more politically naive mess. Immigration. I don't normally particularly like touching on this subject because it's a bit of a live wire, and trying to balance pragmatic concerns with humanitarian concerns. We live in an age without nuance, without subtlety. People are unable to comprehend, understand, or grasp shades of grey. So I tend to get it from both sides whenever I talk about immigration. But this ties into the climate thing as well. If you think it's bad at the moment, it could be 100 times as bad relatively soon, as climate is an aggravating factor in civil wars and so on. A lot of analysts believe that climate change helped worsen and deepen the drought and so on in Syria, which helped touch off the civil war there, which led to 1 million migrants and all the problems that attend it. And that's likely to only get worse. So if you're right-wing and anti-immigration, you should be pro-green. Green shouldn't be a left-right polarizing issue. It makes sense from whatever perspective you go at. But unfortunately, it's been turned into one. But anyway, this is kind of beside the point. So a fire broke out at an overcrowded refugee camp on Lesbos, according to Greek officials. So at least one person killed, possibly another victim, a child. You know how that tends to tug at people's heartstrings and so on. They began protesting. Greek police responded with tear gas and so on. It's not a nice situation for anybody. People are being housed in a ship, which is not the best situation. Have you ever heard of prison hulks? Yeah, being put into a ship instead of a camp is even worse, and the camps aren't particularly nice anyway, and this one was overcrowded. So yeah, and we're heading into autumn and winter, so the conditions in camps are going to be getting worse as well. But all they can really do is smash up the facilities, which looks bad, optics from the outside. Yeah, we should be, even if we end up sending these people back wherever they've come from, we should be looking after them. I think it's only charitable and it's only humanitarian to provide them with a somewhat decent place to live when they wash up on our shores, wherever they might be, Greece or France or even Britain. And we're kind of failing on that. And it doesn't actually take a lot. It doesn't cost a lot to provide halfway decent accommodation for people while you process them. And we could be processing people a hell of a lot faster than we are as well. And when we don't, and when these places get crowded, overcrowded, and then when something like this happens and deaths result, it only polarizes things more, makes people more resentful, and makes people more likely to seek illegal means into the country rather than ending up in these camps and then being processed properly, legally, and so on. So hopefully people can agree that the best thing to do is to treat people as well as we can and to try and prevent situations like this happening. And the way we should respond to them is probably better. But this is a Europe-wide issue and, in a different way, an American issue. And there was an old BBC series ages ago that was kind of prophetic about a lot of this stuff. The divide between the old and the young, the migrant crisis in Europe, kind of dialed up to 11, but they did this whole series of short future scenarios. I can't remember when it was. It may have been 99, 2000, somewhere. I'll try and find it and maybe do a video on it. But they were pretty accurate at predicting a lot of the kind of political upheavals and fault lines that we're developing now. I mean, it's not as bad as they were exaggerating it for dramatic effect, but it was really, really interesting. Okay, this is an interesting conflux of the very old and the very new. There's a fugitive in China, I think. Yeah, southwest China, Yunnan province. So there's a fugitive, a criminal who'd been on the run for 17 years, right? And he'd been apparently living out of a cave this entire time. So he's 63 now. He would have been, what, 46, 56? Yeah, 46 when he originally fled. He had been jailed for trafficking women and children, so not a good dude, before he escaped from a Chinese prison camp in 2002. And he'd just been hiding out in this tiny cave, living off the land, stealing from locals, that sort of thing. They got a few clues about where he might be in early September, which led them to the mountains behind his hometown. So maybe he found this cave when he was a kid, or whatever. He's been basically living as a hermit. But the way they found him was essentially by sending hunter-killer terminators after him. So what they sent drones basically to help cover and canvass a huge area. And the drones eventually spotted a blue-coloured steel tile on top of a steep cliff, which was acting like a roof just over his entrance. And he left a load of rubbish nearby, which is, Stealth 101. How not to be seen. Do not leave your trash near your hiding place. And because of that, they found him. So it's a kind of high-tech, low-tech situation, and I just found the kind of intersection of the two interesting. What I think could be really good is if we can harness drone technology elsewhere to do this sort of thing. If we can use sort of deep learning AI to recognize certain patterns, I'm thinking human remains, right? Then what we do currently when searching for missing children's bodies, shallow graves, all that sort of thing, what we do currently is they send out huge amounts of police and they kind of thump their way through the undergrowth using sticks and so on. If we could send swarms of drones it would be a lot cheaper, a lot less manpower intensive, probably a lot more effective in a lot of areas to do that, and then to follow up with a smaller number of officers and search parties and so on in areas that the drones can't cover. All right. Now, if they can use drones to find a guy like this, then I think we can use drone swarms to find bodies, shallow graves, missing kids, that sort of thing over a wide area, quickly, cheaply, effectively. So maybe I will send a letter to my MP suggesting this, though my MP is a bit of a knob. I'm probably not the best person to talk to. Maybe I'll just send it to the police, see what they think. Shifting across the world to, well, not from China, but from here, to Auckland, New Zealand. So there is a store, a sports company called ASICS. I don't know how it's pronounced. And they have big screens outside their store, and that's like a big thing for them. It's a Japanese company, and so it's notable that they have these big screens outside their store. But hackers got into them because apparently they weren't very well protected and played hardcore porn on them for hours, which I find funny, but a lot of people apparently didn't. 9 hours it took before they realised, failed to defeat the hack, and then eventually turned the screens off. That seems like a long time. Surely the first thing you would do is switch them off, you would think, but no. Apparently many people were shocked and horrified by seeing this. Think of the children. How dare they see the act of love on big screens outside a sports store. Probably got them a lot of business, to be honest. I haven't seen anything on the Austrian election. I will look it up at the end. I'll handle comments and stuff at the end. See, this reminds me, when I were a wee lad, we used to load pornographic screensavers onto not 5.25, the smaller size, the non-floppy floppy disks. And if you peeled out the protective slide, like that, and then you put it into a machine, it would catch, and you couldn't remove it without taking the machine apart. So a few of us had a few japes by putting pornographic screensavers in Ataris and Amigas that were on display in stores like Dixon's and so on. Naughty us. So yeah, primitive hacks work sometimes better than software hacks. Thomas Cook, as you probably gathered, I think last time I did a show, they were under threat of being wound up if there wasn't government intervention to sort of bail them out. There wasn't said intervention, and it's now collapsed. Which means a lot of people were stranded, and there had to be a lot of emergency flights, and a lot of people lost a lot of money and lost their holidays. A lot of weddings were disrupted. If you're one of the people affected, it's probably going to take up to 2 months to get any refunds or anything, and obviously not everybody gets a refund when a company goes into receivership. But they do still have a lot of assets, high street stores and so on. If any of those are owned, that's quite a lot of money that could be raised. So I think you've got a good chance of getting your money back, but you might have to wait a long time. Refunds have to be issued to around 360,000 customers, which is 3 times larger than any previous refund program. It looks like various insurers and so on will be helping shore that up in the short term while Thomas Cook is liquidated, taken apart, and sold off. There were some uncharitable comments about the salaries of the upper end of Thomas Cook. Now, I'm no fan of greedy bosses and executive bonuses in the millions of pounds and so on, particularly if your company is in trouble. But £1 million between 360,000 people That's not going to cover the damages, is it? Even if you completely eliminated all their salaries, all their bonuses, it's not actually going to go that far to make a difference for the staff being laid off or the people seeking refunds. So I'm no fan of bosses, but I think that's a little unfair, and it wouldn't really make that much difference. So there you go. Hong Kong is still pretty much on fire, and what might be driving this is in part a lack of opportunity for younger Chinese people in Hong Kong. There's a lot of anxiety about the future. There's kind of this generational gap again. I mean, the China's child policy has created a kind of population crunch. We're suffering due to the baby boomers, and we're suffering because we don't have enough young people to make money to pay for the care that older people need as they exit the workforce, claim their pensions, go to homes, and so on. So we're suffering there, but in this instance, it's what youth there is are often relatively isolated, discontent, don't have a lot of opportunities. And Hong Kong is kind of arm's length from the rest of China, so they don't necessarily get the same kinds of opportunities and treatment as mainlanders either. So we've got a lot of disaffected youth, a lot of whom are male, and this is across China as a whole. And historically speaking, that has been a problem for societies. When there's a lot of discontent men without female partners or whoever, and without job prospects or future prospects, life prospects, then that tends to lead to disrupted societies, revolution, that sort of thing, which I think we're kind of seeing play out. And I think we're kind of seeing that globally, actually. But in China, I think it's aggravated by the fact that Hong Kong used to be this massive free enterprise zone that was administered by the British, who brought in democratic reforms and so on. Imperialism is not cool, kids. Don't do it. But of the imperial powers, I think Britain was probably the least horrendous. And we dismantled our empire with a relative amount of grace and dignity and all the rest. But at the time, 1997, I remember being somewhat outraged that we weren't allowing people to flee. I felt that we owed Hong Kong a great deal. We eventually did the right thing by the Gurkhas, but I don't feel that we really did the right thing by the Hong Kong Chinese. If they wanted to come to Britain, I think we should have fast-tracked that for a lot of them. I mean, a lot of people wanted to stay. There are a lot of Chinese nationalists, even with Hong Kong. It's quite crazy, actually. I suggest you watch some of the guys like Lao Wai here on YouTube who live in China, are married to Chinese nationals, and who talk about it a lot, because they quite often, because they're Westerners in China, they run into racism, quite frankly, and exploitation of white people who live in China. They're often kind of tapped for use in commercials and so on. Outrageous stereotypes that we wouldn't accept anywhere else in the world and so on. And they often run afoul of Chinese nationalists who hate them just for marrying Chinese women, for saying anything even remotely slightly negative about China. If you follow Naomi Wu at all, and why wouldn't you? She's awesome. She's a bit Chinese nationalist. I think she's kind of on the edge, walking that line a bit. But she had some fairly heated discussions on Twitter over the last couple of days about this sort of thing. So if you go and check her timeline, you can kind of see the same thing playing out. I do think we're kind of more negative than we need to be about China, but it does have a lot of issues, such as concentration camps for Muslims. I'm no fan of Islam, but that seems to me to be a stretch too far. Their nationalism is out of control. They're quite horrendously racist in a lot of ways. An archly conservative society, very collectivist, but China always has been, even without communism. communism. But yeah, we're kind of seeing this play out in Hong Kong, and I wonder if it's going to spread to the mainland, in which case we can expect China to go full Tiananmen Square on people, I'm afraid. And that could be another factor leading to another global recession, along with Brexit and the oil crisis. But there we go. Moving back locally. So Boris Johnson, he's a controversial fellow in a controversial period in British politics, heading a controversial minority government, and he is just gaffe prone. He has a habit of saying things and doing things that do not go down very well with most people, but do go down very well with a small number of people. Daily Mail readers, for example. He claims he's been the model of restraint when it comes to language around the Brexit debate, but he keeps hammering home this idea of the Surrender Act or whatever, and the idea that by implication, if not directly, and he has said this directly, that anyone moving to Fox and no deal Brexit is somehow a traitor or something. To me, a traitor is someone who threatens the well-being of their country, who colludes with foreign powers to do harm to their own country or to help another country who is an enemy or a rival. The EU are not our rivals, they're not our enemies, they're our neighbours, they are still currently our allies, and whether you're talking about NATO or the EU, to characterise preventing a no-deal Brexit, which would be disastrous for this country and would hurt our allies, as being a surrender is absurd, and it does play into the kind of language and reaction that led to the death of Joe Cox. Now, people overplay that. This is one crazy person with a homemade gun. You can't always account for that. Most death threats and nastiness on Twitter and whatever is spurious, but he is increasing the heat in the system, and people do snap eventually, and a lot of people don't bother to fact check or anything. So if someone like Boris, who's the Prime Minister, is playing this populist game of condemning his opponents in ways that aren't accurate and so on, then I think it is dangerous. I think there is a core of a genuine issue here where this can meet the demands of the harm principle, and it does seem to have been increasing death threats and so on. I don't take those particularly seriously when they're internet threats and so on. And I don't think anyone should particularly, but they should still be examined, potentially investigated, if they're kind of repeated or they're specific or they're particularly graphic or whatever. A third of the country still backs Boris, even in the event of a no-deal Brexit. Now, that means 2/3 don't. But he's playing into this idea that it's the people against Parliament and the judges and the establishment and so on. You don't get more establishment than Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg and so on. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's all bullshit. If there are traitors in all of this, it's members of the government and their advisors who are going to right-wing populist governments across the EU and asking them to veto any further extension. Right, because that is genuinely colluding with foreign governments to do harm to this country. That, if anything, that is traitorous, right? And the illegal shenanigans and so on around the referendum, that strikes me as being more close to traitorous. But people are swallowing it. Parliament is actually doing its job. This is what it's supposed to do. I've got a video planned for some point in the future to go over a lot of British political institutions and what the actual role of an MP is and how our democracy is supposed to work. I don't expect it will convert many people, but it'll make me feel better to get it out there. So expect that at some point. But they are doing their job by scrutinising what the government is doing, by attempting to rule out a no-deal Brexit. They're doing what they're supposed to. They're finally actually leading and acting in the country's best interest. Whereas I don't think the Brexiters are, especially since stories have come out now about a lot of them have links with various Tory party backers and investment firms and so on that are shorting the pound in and other stocks in anticipation of a crash out Brexit, which may explain why he seems to be going for that, because it will profit a lot of people in his circle and himself as a result. This is actually something good, credit where it's due, right? I've just heavily criticised the Conservative Party and the government, but here's a good thing. The Health Secretary is looking seriously at compulsory vaccines for school children, which I think is a good thing. I think when it comes to health, right, you need to override a certain degree of personal choice for the sake of everybody else, and for the people who can't have vaccines for whatever reason. So, because of the surge and the rise in diseases like measles and so on, it makes sense to make them compulsory. Now, if you really, really want to, you can still avoid giving your kids vaccines by taking them out of school and homeschooling them. They're going to suffer for it in terms of socialization and educational attainment. Though, to be fair, the research is somewhat mixed on that. If you really do spend the time when it comes to homeschooling and you give them a proper curriculum and it's not like a religiously bigoted one or whatever else, and if you spend a lot of time and effort making sure that they socialize with other kids, then it's fine. But that's a lot of ifs and buts. Okay, so yeah, it's a bit shifty. In particular, it's the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, and rubella, that has been declining in many countries across Europe, which means a lot of people are potentially exposed to that. Those can have particularly nasty effects if you're pregnant when you suffer from those, for the child and for yourself. So this is concerning. So yeah, credit where it's due. If the Health Secretary is exploring this as an idea, I back it as an idea. Right? We don't want more breakouts. We want to ensure that we have sufficient herd immunity to protect people who can't, for whatever reason, have the injection. MMR, and that's the one that does leave a little scar. Yeah, I've got a tiny little scar back here on my shoulder from it, which is part of the reason I think people avoid that one, because it leaves a physical remnant. Though I think they've changed it. I think since I had it, because when I had it, I was actually ill off school on the day that we had that injection, so I had to go and have it done separately. But yeah, it left a little scar. I have a little sort of knot of skin there that's prone to various problems, but better than having measles, mumps, or rubella, quite frankly. Now, the Welsh Nationalist Party. There's been a sudden surge of interest in nationalism in the regions in the UK. Now, this isn't populist nationalism. This is kind of separatist nationalism, and the nationalist parties in Wales and Scotland, and actually the IRA, their political wing Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland, they're all quite left wing, which isn't kind of something you traditionally associate with nationalism. And it's not that same kind of populist nationalism, save perhaps in Northern Ireland. It's more of a populist left nationalism. So what's interesting is, as we've got these regional parliaments, Scotland and Wales, they're much more left wing than our main government, our UK government. England doesn't have a regional parliament. If it did, and it was elected under similar ways, I suspect it would be quite left wing, in the same way that kind of the Greater London Council under Red Ken during the Thatcher years, or the local government of Liverpool in the same period, those were all quite left wing. I suspect we'd see something similar if we had an English Parliament. I suspect that would then be at odds with central government as well. Not that's particularly in the offing, but yeah. But anyway, so they're quite left wing is the point I'm getting at, with Scotland in particular, keeping a downward pressure on tuition fees and prescription fees, things like that. Now, the Welsh National Parliament has been recommended, thanks to a commission they set up, has recommended that all social care in Wales, so that's care for the elderly and so on, should be free at the point of need. We can afford this as a society, but it is quite expensive and will continue to get more expensive until the boomers die off, which is a horrible way to put it, but it's true. But they want to introduce a slight local tax increase to cover coverage, social care for everybody in Wales. I suspect others, like the SNP, will follow suit, and I can't really fault them, because at the moment it is really kind of stripping assets that families can pass on. So it's the fact that if you get really old and infirm and you have to sell off your house to pay for your nursing care and so on, that stops a lot of people getting that kind of generational boost. It's not the really wealthy people that are being affected so much, because they have enough to cover whatever care privately that they need. But other people are having their ability to sort of climb the social ladder taken away from them, particularly in the UK, where owning your house is a big thing, much bigger than it is in a lot of other European nations, where renting is just the default. People have a lot of protections as renters, rights over the property that they're renting and so on. Here, not so much. We still have slumlords and so on, but everyone wants to own their home. It's a big cultural thing. It's a way in which people hold on to money and assets and appreciate their assets. So when you can't keep hold of your property and you have to sell it to cover you during your old age and infirmity, and there's a lot of predatory firms getting people to remortgage their houses and so on as they get old as well to fund their retirement, it creates a generational poverty trap problem for people at the lower end. So it could be a good thing if we tax a bit more and guarantee people a basic level of social care. That sounds like a good idea to me. Labour were promising something similar at their conference, but whether they get a whiff of power remains to be seen. Bojo again. He's been the target of a whole lot of attacks lately. I think a lot of this is just opportunism. Cashing in on his lack of popularity, trying to stick the boot in while he's down, while he can't get anything through Parliament. While he's helpless, he's being booed and having things thrown at him, even heading into the Tory party conference. Find the video for that. It's quite funny. But I think a lot of this is opportunism. Whenever anyone rises to a level of real prominence, a lot of people come out of the woodwork with accusations and so on. And the accusations here are that he has groped people like 20 years ago, that he's had affairs. We know he's had affairs, and so on. It's all to try and call his reputation into question, to say he's unfit for government. But having an affair or touching someone's thigh 20 years ago doesn't strike me as relevant to someone's political competence. I think this is a pointless waste of time as a way to attack him. I don't think it does anything useful. It will only cement the idea in a lot of his supporters' eyes that he's just being targeted by the elites or whatever. I think it's just a total backfire. It's like a lot of the ways they've gone after Trump. I think it might please your own base to go after him in this way, but it cements his base and may even create more sympathy for him. I would stick to political arguments if I were you. We know he's unfit for government. We know he's incompetent. Why take away from that message by saying he's a horn dog? Well, so were a lot of people, and it has no bearing whatsoever on his ability to govern, which is terrible anyway. So I think that's a mistake. So BBC Click is this series that's been running for years. It's like a short technology magazine programme that they put out on BBC News every week. They did a really interesting report this weekend on how the London College of Fashion is exploring sort of augmented reality, mixed reality things. Now, if you order clothes online, like I do, you often find that the fit isn't quite right, or the sizing is different between different countries. Like a UK medium is different to a US medium, is different to a Chinese medium. A lot of places are kind of compensating for that by showing you the exact measurements or suggesting that you order a size lower or a size higher depending where you're ordering from, which is great. But the fit and the cut and everything, you can't really tell without trying something on. So the idea here is that you use smartphone apps, even body scanning in some cases, to create an avatar of yourself. And then the program will allow you to dress your avatar in the clothing as accurately as possible to show how you will actually look in what you're ordering. A lot of people do order clothes online because they're cheap, but if you go down a high street in the UK still, if you can find one that has any life to it, what you tend to find is takeaways, restaurants, cafes, pawn shops, PAWN, and places like clothing stores, maybe the odd sort of in-town supermarket, right? Places where you actually have to go physically to get things, and where it's better to get things physically, where you can either have an experience or a meal or try things on. So here comes that being disrupted by technology, right? Because you'll now be able to actually see how something will fit, get a better idea of whether it'll look good on you, and so on, by having this sort of virtual doll avatar of yourself. So expect high street fashion to go belly up next if this technology gets taken up and gets spread. Yeah, the disruption is not ending anytime soon. Now, I actually welcome this, because without clothing stores having bricks and mortar, the price goes down for the consumer. Shipping, if it's done right, reduces carbon footprints, because a single delivery van can deliver to several places. The more they have loaded up on them, the more efficient it gets, and so on. This is better than you driving in, pootling around, whatever, coming home, you know. So in terms of climate footprint, it's a lot better. But this is interesting, and this is going to be the next thing. And then the next thing after that will probably be clothes printers. Print-on-demand clothing. Right? We already get that with T-shirts with patterns and so on. But what if you could get robotically tailored clothing that makes you look really good? That's probably going to be the next thing, I would think. And not too far away either, I should imagine. They also talked about augmented reality goggles for swimmers. Now, I haven't been swimming in a very long time, basically since I got cripplingly short-sighted, because I can't see, and prescription goggles are hella expensive. Now, if you could get prescription goggles with augmented reality, so they can like show you how fast you're going, how much distance you've done, how many calories you've lost, maybe some fun augmented reality games or whatever while you're swimming. Then, if I continue to lose weight and could get prescription goggles relatively cheaply, I wonder if any of the online glasses firms do those. Then I might be tempted back to the pool. Of course, I'd have to wear a swimming cap now because my hair is a lot longer. But you take my point. But that's interesting. So we're seeing augmented reality get closer. Glass never really took off. That wasn't exactly augmented reality. There's Microsoft's thing that's always a year or two away. You know, there's Chinese knockoff augmented reality and social media glasses and things. It's coming, but I remember all the fuss around glass and how upset people were that they might be being spied on or recorded without their say-so. Don't know. Maybe attitudes have changed since. We'll see. Elon Musk is gearing up for his Moon and Mars rockets to enter testing. Not long after NASA's new Super Heavy rocket was being tested and talked about. So they're building their prototypes and plan to start flying them in the next few months. It's what he calls a Starship, which is a bit grandiose. yes, they'll be doing test takeoffs and landings. I guess this is part of its bigger, landing rocket. But it's interesting because we're going to see SpaceX directly up against, old school NASA, Orion rockets. We're going to see the two differences of approach. Maybe we'll get an idea which one is the way to go in the future. But maybe he's just looking for NASA contracts. We'll see. I need to take a quick break for a second. I'll leave you with some adverts and I'll be back ASAP. A problem for every games master has always been coming up with adventure ideas. For years now, Postmortem Studios has been helping out with the 100 Adventure Seeds line. These provide adventure ideas for all genres, and you can get them at RPG Now or Lulu.com. At the end of World War II, the Axis and the Allies went to war with A-bombs until nobody was left to fight. In this atomic wasteland, a new breed of rockabilly hero arises. From the gleaming domes of Science City Zero to the sleazy roller derbies of Vegas and the sky fortress of the Fourth Reich, there's a new world for the taking. 45 Psychobilly Retropocalypse, available at Lulu.com and RPG Now.
Aren't you a little tired of so-called horror media about shiny, sparkly, angsty, whiny monsters? I know I am, and that's why I created Actual Fucking Monsters, where you will play an actual fucking monster doing horrible and monstrous things and being tracked down and killed for it. Buy now at DriveThruRPG, post-mort.com or lulu.com.
The Atomic Age, with its A-bombs, transistorized radios, jet engines, and a new breed of dangerous supervillain, requires heroes to face the challenge. That's where you come in. The world needs you, Agent of Swing.
"Rrrr," said the grinder as it chewed its way through Alice, from the crown of her head all the way down to her toes. It ate the lot of her, unfussy, snout to tail, and cleared its plate. It gnashed its way through her dress, her pinafore, her shoes, and her unmentionables. It chewed her hair, devoured her scalp, gobbled up her arms, wolfed down her legs, gorged itself on her torso, noshed on her skin, and gulped her down without so much as a burp to show for it.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?
Sorry about that. Print-proof delivery of the Actual Fucking Monsters companion, amongst other things. I can already see a couple of things that need to be corrected, so I'll have to be doing another one of those. But there we go. Right. Since we're talking about green issues a lot lately, bit of a controversy, as a load of waste and rubbish from the UK ended up being shipped to China by the waste company Biffa, B-I-F-F-A. You've probably seen their sort of large shop and industrial bins around if you're British. Excuse me. They've been fined £350,000 for sending UK household waste, including used nappies and sanitary towels, to China. That's legal, but they had illegally labelled the waste as paper, which it wasn't. Now, this is kind of an unspoken thing that goes on in a lot of countries, shipping their waste to China for processing and so on. In some ways that's good because it takes it away from us, and China is economically better able to process it and make it into useful stuff. They have more space than we do, particularly in the UK. We're a very densely populated country, so in some ways it's not exactly bad. In other ways it is. Exchange rates can also have a massive effect on this, because it can be profitable to send rubbish to China, even though obviously transporting stuff has a bigger carbon footprint and so on. But there you go. So, the last date we have the full figures for is 2016. Oh, and my mic's still down. Okay, never mind. Can you hear me now? Yes, good. Oh, you could hear me. Okay. Why are there two mic settings? Never mind. Okay, so in 2016, we generated 222.9 million tonnes of waste, which was up 4% from the previous reporting period, which was 2014. England, which is the most densely populated and wealthiest part of the country, was responsible for 85% of that waste. Construction and demolition generates the most. That's about 136 million tonnes a year. Mineral waste accounts for about 36% of the total. That's anything left over from mining or quarrying that can't be used again. And household waste is 27.3 million tonnes, with 17.7 million of other, which I'm guessing is commercial waste, medical waste, things like that. Allegedly, the recycling rate for UK households is 45.7%, which isn't bad. Wales manages 57.6%, which is pretty good. And it's the only UK country to exceed the EU's target to recycle at least 50% of waste by 2020. Now, this may be being misreported, because a lot of what's supposed to be recycling ends up in the normal rubbish area. I have literally seen the waste collection people pick up the green recycling bin and dump it in with the rest of the trash. How often that happens, what our recycling rate would be if that didn't happen, if things were properly processed, I don't know. The other problem is we've got a patchwork of recycling, so if you live in one area, they can be particularly hardcore about what you're allowed to put in the bin, the recycling bin, and not, or they don't accept certain things that in another area they do, and there's no rhyme or reason to any of it particularly. It's a confusing patchwork that's probably holding us back. We do seem to be recycling at least our paper, cardboard, metal and glass, but then we kind of always have waste metal like tinfoil and stuff, and glass we used to recycle all the time, right? Fizzy drinks bottles used to be glass, and there was a deposit in with how much they cost. God, this is aging me. So if you kept your glass bottles and you took them back, you would get some money back, which was nice. But 2/3 of plastic waste in the UK is sent overseas to be recycled, so it makes even less sense that different areas have different rules about what can and can't be recycled, because we're sending all of it abroad to be recycled in the first place. Who fucking knows? China used to import most of the world's plastic waste to use in recycling and to help empower its industry, but they're increasingly concerned about contamination and pollution, and they're no longer going to be doing that to the same extent, which means that other countries, Malaysia's been mentioned, Turkey, Poland, Indonesia, they're now taking that up for as long as it's economically viable anyway. But Malaysia has said they're going to start sending some of it back. So if we ship them stuff that can't be recycled, they're going to send it back to us. Yeah, these are problems. Ideally, all this kind of recycling should be done as locally as possible in the first place, and it's just not profitable in more developed nations because of the labour costs, basically, and the upfront cost of investing in the industry to do it. But if one company has been caught mislabeling stuff and shipping it illegally, you can bet that there's 10 more waiting in the wings, and that fine is not going to put any of them off if they're operating at a large scale. More environmental stuff. David Attenborough's weighed in on making moves to save kelp forests. Now, these are actually local to Britain. It's not somewhere exotic like the Amazon or wherever. There are these big kelp forests in the sea off the Sussex coast. And in our area of the world, they're one of the most biodiverse areas that there are. Kind of like our equivalent of coral reefs, I suppose. And it also absorbs a lot of carbon, which is a good thing. So we should be expanding these. But they're under a lot of threat from trawlers, which basically scrape up the bottom of the sea. They knock out a lot of the kelp. They're rich fishing grounds for a reason, but there's better reasons to keep them as they are, relatively pristine, to preserve and protect them. And yeah, we can do that, but we haven't. So Attenborough's weighed in on that. We're really going to feel it. I mean, he's really old now. We're really going to feel it when he goes. I sense we're going to lose a powerful advocate for nature and the environment and animals and plants and everything else. I don't know who's going to take his place. Chris Packham's pretty good, but he doesn't have the same kind of gravitas to the way he speaks that Attenborough has. It's kind of an open question. I'm sure someone will rise up to take his place, but while we've got him, he is a very powerful advocate. Sticking with the environmental thing, the Scottish government, so kudos to them for this, they are planning to slacken the planning permission restrictions for green projects. So going green will mean less red tape. So if you're doing a project that is carbon capture or carbon neutral, or homes that are ecologically zero carbon, or electrical filling stations is one example, then basically the government is going to get out of your way for you to do those sorts of things. So the Scottish government has set itself an aim for Scotland to reduce its emissions to net zero by 2045. That's actually fairly possible in Scotland. There's a lot of wild areas that could be reforested. There's a lot of commercial forestry already, which you could expand into a sort of carbon capture sort of effort. And this is a good thing, especially part of it. I mean, part of the reason I picked out this story is I have some local experience with this, because part of the idea is to create affordable, environmentally friendly homes. Now, we had a little project just up the road in a tiny little village called Binley, where they built a handful of eco-friendly homes. Now, there's been a lot of property development around here, and especially recently. And what they do every time, right, is a development company comes in. They say, okay, we want to buy this land. In exchange, we will make some of these homes set aside for local people. These will be affordable homes for local people. It never works out that way, right? Even with the slight discounts that they offer, like 10% if you've got an established history in the village or whatever, they're just not affordable. This is a really highly desirable area. It's a very chocolate boxy village, at least for now. We've got a river running through it, the fields, the woods, what's left of them up there now. So the prices are really high, right? We've got a good local school, all this kind of stuff. We're not far from the main train line to London. All of these things drive up the prices. But every time they come in and they buy up a greenfield site and they say, we're going to build houses, and we all protest, not to be NIMBYs, because, wow, this latest scheme they want to build on water meadows, which is supposed to be protected. But it seems like they're getting the go-ahead. And we have problems with flooding locally. So more houses, more tarmac, more strain on the sewerage system. Not a great idea until that gets sorted. But anyway, I digress. The point is, they always say they're going to make local homes for local people. It never works out that way, and we just end up with another housing development full of posh commuters or weekend homeowners who are even more wealthy. But they did this little eco project up in Binley where they built a handful of houses that are carbon negative, I think, and they are kind of self-warming, so you don't have to spend so much on heating and so on in the winter. They're quite small and compact, very efficient in terms of space and so on. But those actually went to local people, and they were affordable to local people. So if they're talking about that in Scotland, this is the thing that attracted me to it, then that may actually be how things end up. And Scotland, like my village, has a big problem with young people just leave. And never come back to the villages. Lack of opportunities, cost of living, and so on. So similar problems, not identical, less the cost of living thing in Scotland. But if they're making affordable eco homes in Scotland, I think that's a good thing. And if my local experience matches up to what goes on in Scotland and perhaps further afield, there can only be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Breakthroughs in ultrasound for spotting cancer. So basically higher resolution ultrasound, more effective ultrasound. They can now produce scans that are 10 times better than current scans and better at detecting cancerous tumours. So what this means in practice is that you can get a much faster, much easier diagnosis of cancers by using ultrasound for a lot of cancers, not all by any means, but for a lot of them. It also means less biopsies. So this should speed up our response to people's cancers, should increase our survival rate, which isn't fantastic in the UK because cancer is a long-term, expensive, difficult treatment. And the NHS operates on triage, which is why its mental health support isn't so good. I wouldn't have it any other way, but just to point that out. So yeah, this seems to be working really well so far, and we may be able to increase the resolution even more. This current advance takes us to 10 times current resolution, and that's why it's so good. So possibly good news. Of course, replacing ultrasound equipment is going to be expensive, but I guess since maternity wards can use the same equipment, then maybe departments can share the burden, though knowing how bureaucracies work, probably not. Sticking with health, a whole bunch of studies have kicked off in the wake of some high-profile suicides at universities and schools and so on into teen mental health. Obviously, this is an issue that I am interested in, and a big grant has been put out to do further investigations and to find sort of best practices and so on. From my experience, one of the problems that they might run into is resistance to the idea of being diagnosed, particularly when you're young, and you might well end up with kids not wanting to be diagnosed and so resistant to being diagnosed, receiving counselling, the stigma that goes along with it, the bullying increase that will go along with it. I had my first mental health wobble, I guess, when I was at college. I would have been 17 or 18. My parents had just split. There was a lot of stress and strain associated with that, looking after my brother and so on, because he went off the rails a little bit. I went to a really good college, Peter Symonds in Winchester. The staff were fantastic, and it was actually them that saw that something was wrong with me and got me counselling. I didn't particularly ask for it, but I did resist it, and directed the counsellors to do more to do with my brother, and to a lesser extent my mum at the time, when I probably could have actually used the help and probably had a lot to talk about, but it was important to me at the time to just kind of be the strong one and look after everyone else. So I was very resistant. That was at college. If it had happened when I was at school, I think I would have resisted more, because there would have been the stigma and the bullying, which I already got a lot of at secondary school, to be quite honest. And wouldn't have wanted any more. Wouldn't have wanted to be singled out as a bit of a mentalist at the time. I think they'll run into that. So you can't really help people who don't want to be helped. But since this is investigating and trying to find out the best ways to tackle it, I think that's a better approach. Maybe they'll find some brilliant way of helping people. For me, the problem is that all these kind of initiatives are broad brush, and they don't get down into the nitty-gritty of people's individuated problems. That to me is the issue with mental health care in this country. They want a one-size-fits-all, and particularly with mental health care, no such thing. Back in the day, 20-odd years ago, Tony Blair set a target for 50% university attendance. I didn't end up going to university. Don't particularly miss it, other than the living away from home and the sort of learning that sort of side of things to cope and so forth. But we've actually reached 50% university. Now, what I find interesting about that is that the bulk of that is the amount of women going to university, because the amount of men going to university has been in decline. So we've reached that 50% with a lot more women going to university and a lot less men. And that has knock-on problems for society and so on. Not that anyone should ever expect things to be entirely equal, but it does show that there's a relative lack of opportunities, for which I would suggest more apprenticeships and vocational training, things like that men seem to be more attracted to. I would have liked to go to university, but it just wasn't viable, really, at the time, for a whole bunch of reasons. They do actually mention the gender gap in this article on the BBC, which I think is good of them. And they mention that currently, so it's 50.2% of young adults are going to university now and running up debt. That's another issue. But that's 57% of women and only 44.1% of men. And yet attempts to use equality legislation to provide additional help for men is running into resistance and problems from feminist groups. And I don't want to fall into the MRA K-hole here, but it's a men's issue. I don't consider myself to be a men's human rights activist per se. I consider myself to be an egalitarian. If men are losing out, it creates problems, as we're seeing in Hong Kong, as I covered earlier. So there we go. Let's end with some good news. The satirical puppet show Spitting Image is set to return to television. On the one hand, great. On the other hand, I'm not sure that today's politics is particularly satirizable, because it's so fucking absurd. But we've had previews of a couple of the puppets. Donald Trump, obviously. Apparently his arsehole is going to make tweets for him. That's the big thing with him. So they're kind of dialing it up to 11 or 12, I think, when it comes to satirizing Trump. Putin is going to appear as a half-naked guy in S&M gear. I think they're kind of going after his obviously closeted homosexuality there. But Spitting Image never held back on anyone. So the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan, is going to appear in a glittery top with the word princess on it. Harry's been particularly savaged. I'm interested to see what they'll do with Bojo, how he'll look. But you can find various puppets out there. The one of Kanye West is a little soft, I think. They could have gone a little harder there. The one of Mark Zuckerberg kind of looks like Data in terms of skin tone and so on. If you never saw Spitting Image, I pity you. If you're not British, you probably won't have seen anything quite like it. The Germans had a similar show, I think. I can't remember what it was called. But it's just absolutely vicious satire. And we've needed something like that, I think, for a while. Though I expect it's going to fall afoul of cancel culture and PC culture, because they were never, ever PC. It's a great song. I've never met a nice South African. look that one up. Other stuff. They had a couple of hits actually of satirical songs and things. I'm glad they're coming back. I hope they haven't had their balls snipped off and will still go all out against everyone and everything and satirise everything. But it was cancelled in '96 because the audience wasn't there. Maybe today the audience will be there again. And maybe we're starting to see a backlash to cancel culture from which they can profit. Right, let's have a quick look through your comments and everything. If you've got any questions or comments, please type them in quickly. Colin says, I did piss poor at school because I wasn't under the right kind of pressures. Yeah, and there isn't a lot of support for a lot of different types of kids at school. I had a friend who wasn't book smart at all. He had an exactly average IQ, right? And a few reading and writing difficulties. And there wasn't the support then that there is now, particularly. But he had a kind of low animal cunning. And he was a very hard worker, very, very good friend of mine back in the day. And school just wasn't right for him in the way that it was set up. Again, this education is another one of these things where you need a more individuated approach, I think. And going back to what Labour wants to do with private schools can provide that kind of individuated approach, and we have seen a more individuated approach in like academy schools that specialise in music or art or technology or whatever. But then again, if you specialise too early, you can end up very hemmed in terms of education and further education and career and so on. But I do think, like as in most things, we need a more specialised individual approach. We talked about the cocaine thing, but you say, Colin, I'll stick to booze because there's about 300 years of records on the long, medium and short-term damages. Yeah, we're well aware. If you go into things well aware of exactly what the harm is going to be, I think it's a bit different. Trouble with that when it comes to drugs like cocaine, heroin, mushrooms, acid, pot, and so on, is that there's a lot of vested interest in attacking it that warps the research. You end up with activist research that's just... Another thing I used to do in college, there was a really successful sort of drugs messaging program in Liverpool and so on. This was, the rave scene was still a big thing at the time. That's kind of new age hippie movement. The dance clubs were really taking off. Not that was my scene, but they wanted to imitate this successful program that was going on up there, down here in the south, around sort of Winchester, throughout Hampshire, really. And I won a competition doing some cartoons, and got the job of doing some of this work. It was quite well paid, actually, as well. It was part local council, part charity. And the idea was that you would inform people accurately about what the effects of drugs and so on. The idea was to build trust with the younger people, the drug-using community and so on. I would have been 17, 18 at the time, though it continued for a while. So I did a bunch of sort of cartoon pamphlets talking about the genuine medical side effects and so on, not just trying to scream bloody murder about drugs and scare people off them, but to actually inform them. And we were starting to have some success, and we were getting some kudos and so on, and then the government pulled the plug because they felt that we were encouraging drug use by telling the truth. Because, when it comes to pot and mushrooms, there's not a lot you can really say that's negative. Certainly not at the time. There's been some research since about the long-term effects of really, really powerful pot can have on schizophrenia and so on, but it's still pretty mild. With mushrooms, the only negative thing we could really say about mushrooms was you might pick the wrong ones. But that didn't satisfy the government, so that the plug was pulled, even though this program had been really successful in Manchester, Liverpool sort of area, and we felt that we were being successful locally. It didn't fit the Conservative Party messaging at the time. What can you do? People want to punish and scare quite often rather than doing what's effective or right. It's a problem you run into everywhere. Do I think Fireman Sam would touch on the issue? Hasn't he been cancelled because fireman is sexist? I'm sure I read something about that. Morning Ben, morning none of your business. Right, so any comments on the Austrian election? I did not see anything about that, so let's have a look. So that was yesterday. The far right support has collapsed, apparently. Well, that's good. Hopefully we're turning a corner on far right populism. So the collapsed government has been returned to power after this snap election, gaining 5.7%. Still minority supports 37.1%, but I think they're a proportional representation system in Austria. He scrapped his coalition with the far-right Freedom Party after a scandal over favours being offered to a Russian investor. So this looks like it's basically moved Austria back towards the centre, which is a good thing, though centre-right. So, yeah. Not perfect. The Freedom Party, meanwhile, which is the far-right group that he was in coalition with, I guess kind of like how the Conservatives are in coalition with the DUP over here, who are pretty far-right, they dropped almost 10 points in support due to these scandals, and their anti-immigrant message failed to resonate as strongly as it had in 2017. So that's interesting, and I think that's a good result. So thank you for bringing that to my attention. That's made me a little bit happier than I was. Ben says Thomas Vogt. Yes, Thomas Cook was Vogt. None of your business says smoke and mirrors is the standard procedure for populists. Sadly, this is true. Melbuena Serrano, all from York, says the first thing to do would be get off the panic train. Look, right. It is virtually impossible to be hysterical enough about the climate issues, okay? And we're already in the midst of a lot of them. Read this, right? It's terrifying, but it is also thoroughly cited, okay? You've got references, full index, extracts from the articles that it has referenced in case they disappear from the internet, which is something I should have thought of for Inside Gamergate. Right? It's all there, thoroughly cited. This is far and away the majority of the research, right? It's still on citations, okay? That much of the book is citations and support, okay? And it's fairly approachable, though it's a tough read. There shouldn't be a huge echo. I did switch the mic off, the other mic. How's that? Is that better? Why did nobody say anything? Okay. None business's epic grim voice. Well, I guess you should have actually told me that was an echo rather than my voice. What seems to have happened is even though I turned the mic off, it was still on, and the audio input capture was also on. So I apologise. None of us says in Austria a comedy group called Marschek did a puppet show sometime back. That may have been it. Let me have a look. Well, epic echo is good. It's either that or really lower my voice. Marschek comedy group. I don't know that that's it. German version of Spitting Image. Hurrah Deutschland was the German version of Spitting Image and was modelled after it. It only ran from 89 to 91, so I'm amazed I ever heard of it. But there you go. I squirrel away weird information. Right. Are we done? Are there any more questions or comments about any of the news stories of today? If not, I will just ask you to please subscribe, because this is not the same channel as my main channel. And please let other people know about it. I'm trying to build this channel up, because apparently live streaming was really hurting the growth of my other channel. For some reason, YouTube. Yeah, who knows? Right, I'm off then. Today is my dust mite attack day, so I will spend much of the rest of the day cleaning the house top to bottom to deal with this new allergy I've been diagnosed with. So that's fun. At least I get to wear my cool little breathing masks. See, check it out. Rawr, rawr. So, worthwhile on that score. And yeah, next month, Schlocktoberfest. So if you've got any requests for anything schlocky or horror related for me to put out for games, RPGs, let me know. Leave a comment or email me or talk to me on Discord or wherever else you can find me. I'll leave you to it now. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. I'm feeling kind of manic because all the meds have kicked in and the caffeine. So hopefully I can get a lot done. Take care. Have a good one. And zang.
Oh!